So good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:30, so we figure it's time to kick off, although there's still a few people to join us, and I'm sure they can join us as they're able to do so. So hello, it's Maidi Horden from DFAT. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you so much to ACFID for hosting this webinar and the first in a series of webinars for this year. For those of you who I haven't met, I'm the Operations Manager for the ANCP. I'm still pretty new to the team. I've met a number of you, even if it is via email, and thank you for your warm welcome. I've got here in Canberra in the room with me today Glenn Williams, our Smarty Grants guru, who many of you have met and talked to over the years. So as we discuss RDE today, and for those organisations that will be submitting their RDE worksheets, if you have any questions about how Smarty Grants works in logging your RDE, then Glenn is here to answer those questions. And I also have Kate Coffey with me, who has recently joined the ANCP operations team, and Kate is going to be our focal point for RDE this year and coordinating it, just although we're all involved in the team, she's going to be sort of driving it and keeping it in line for us. So I'm going to introduce to you all now Sterling International, one of our partners that many of you will be familiar with, as Sterling do undertake a number of accreditation assessments. So many of you may have met members of the Sterling team from time to time. But from Sterling on the line today, we have Roger Williams and also Peter Turner and Keanu Aya. And Roger in particular has been looking at recognised development expenditure for us, and Sterling International, the team there, will be undertaking the assessments of your RDE submissions on behalf of DFAT. They're contracted to do that. And they will also be undertaking around 5 RDE spot checks, and Roger will cover that in his presentation. So Roger and the team at Sterling are really going to drive the presentation today, and they're the subject matter experts in this area, so they are here, of course, to answer any of the technical questions you have about RDE and how to calculate it. Before we get started, we thought we might just open up to those of you that are online, just to introduce yourselves, because of course we can all see everyone's names as they pop up on the list, but just so we know who's on the line and which organisation you're dialing in from today. So might start off with, I think, Anna from World Vision, you're there. Yes, Anna from World Vision is there. She's replying to us by text. And Anna Rose Robinson. So 2 from World Vision on the line. That's fantastic. Anna Rose Robinson is obviously on the line. She's just messaging us at the moment. Anna Rose, if you can just, when you get a chance, just let us know which organisation you're dialing in from. Great. Next we have Anthony McDonald, the Financial Controller from Plan International, on the line. We also have Diane O'Brien from Australian Doctors International. Great. Anna Rose Robinson is calling in from Islamic Relief Australia. We also have Joanna B calling in from Diplomacy Training Program. We have Julia from Family Planning New South Wales, Rocky from Caritas Australia, Lizzie from Fred Hollows, Melville from ADRA, Jody from Motivation Australia, Stephanie from the Royal Australian College of Surgeons, Kayleen calling in from Red Cross, and Monica from Engineers Without Borders, and Diane from Australian Doctors International. I think that is a stock take of who we've got online at the moment. I'm sure there'll be more joining us, but for the moment, let's get underway with Roger's presentation. Hopefully you can all see the slides.
Good afternoon, everybody. If I may, Marty, I'd like to correct your statement that in particular Roger Williams is the RDE. But I'm not going to let my partners get away with that. So I can assure you that Peter Turner in particular, and most certainly Keanu, who's younger and more recent, but nevertheless been involved, are most certainly fully involved with RTE and will be expected to answer questions and not leave me alone in the front line. However, welcome all, and let's get on with it. So our agenda is to quite simply cover the objectives of this webinar, and then perhaps without going into too much detail, there's quite a lot of detail in the slides apropos the calculation of RDE, but you will obviously copy those and have them as a reference, and so we will not bore you with too much of that detail, but we'll certainly be open to questions. With regard to questions, there is a panel on the left of your screen where you can either write a question or simply put your name and a question mark or question, and when we open for questions, we'll we'll open up to you. And I think probably the way I'd like to organize it is that we'll have questions at the end of each segment when it's fresh in your mind. Okay? So yes, we'll be covering the RDE in detail. We'll then be covering common errors and issues which we come across in sheet preparation, which now involves over 50 NGOs. And then finally, before our final question time, we will cover our spot checks and what's involved in them and what our expectations are. So moving on, objectives of the webinar are to clearly report your RDE on a fair and consistent basis. I think fair equality amongst the NGOs is absolutely vital, and that is probably the main reason that all worksheets are checked by us annually together with other financial assessors, and we do everything in our power to ensure it is fair and equitable. Any changes? There haven't been any, so we can assure you that the calculation of the RDE for this year is unchanged from the previous year. As mentioned, we will be covering common errors that are made and dealing with appropriate compliance with ACFID, and finally, as I say, the understanding of the RDE spot checks. The RDE principle, this is all in the ACFID correspondence. We don't need to dwell on it, but the important aspect of this is that it is the Australian community's contribution to your program. It includes the eligible contributions by way of cash or gifts or volunteer services. The lodgement of the RDE at the end of March does have a fairly tight deadline, and it's therefore important that the RDE is reported with as much accuracy as one can achieve, and in order to make our job as easy as possible, because as you know, it then goes through a process of averaging over 3 years into an IPF, which then leads to the sharing of the ANCP as a result of the budget determination in mid-May. And the figures that are used in RDE are not relevant to the financial viability of the NGO, and they do not measure your effectiveness. Do you want to comment on that any more, Pete?
No, that's fine.
Right. Moving on then. As all of you that have previously done RDE, you're aware that it is most importantly based upon audited financial statements. The real purpose of this is that there is an independent auditor. Because of your government funding, you are all reporting entities preparing general purpose accounts, and to have the endorsement of an independent auditor auditing accounts which are fully disclosing, that is of necessary comfort to DFAT in the measurement of your RDE. And an important matter to mention here is that it should be possible for us to relate or derive the figures in your RDE worksheet directly from your financial statements. Now, that may not always be possible, simply because of the accounting system which you are employing, or perhaps more accurately, the way in which you like to cost out your business, and that may not entirely match the requirements of the RDE worksheet or the recommended ACFID Code of Conduct presentation. If that is the case, again, it's important that the figures in the accounts are backed up by a worksheet to bridge across to the RDE worksheet, again, to make our job easier, because for every email we have to send out requesting confirmation of details of figures and the makeup of figures or the breakdown of figures, it takes more time in what, as I've already mentioned, is a pretty tight program. And we'll come to that when we come to common errors and other issues. So we'll move on from there. My partners are sitting back having a very relaxed time here, and we come on to the RDE worksheet. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these details too much, but this is important, and frankly, it's a quirk of Smarty grants that if you look at the green register here, it asks for your name and then your organization. Now, a number of NGOs, some 10 in fact, the person filling in the form put their own name in there, which is perfectly reasonable. It is, after all, what it's asking, and then they put their organization below it. But when it goes on to Smarty grants, and we get a listing, which I have here for last year, and that then lists all 50 of the NGOs, or whatever the latest number is, and it basically shows them all in red, and then as we complete each check, it turns to green. But if the name of the NGO is not shown, but the name of an individual is shown instead. Now, I don't know what you can see from your angle, and whether you can see this, but the information that comes through to us with all your worksheets and other information downloaded shows what is under your name. And I do know that there are several participants in this webinar whose NGO is shown as their name, not as the NGO, which is just below it. I think looking at information provided to us, that the only way you can correct this is to re-register. Now, there is a facility
Roger, it's Marty from DFAT. While we're talking about this point, Glenn's just going to make a smarty grant point here.
Just going to invite him to talk, actually. Good on you. Right.
Yeah, this was an issue last year, everybody, but this year, if you accidentally put your name in that spot, I can fix it from the back end. So I'm keeping an eye on it for this year, and we've already sent it out in the e-news as well, so I'm sure you guys are all across it, and the six that I've seen so far are all correct anyway. So if you make a mistake, I'll let you know via a phone call, but I'll fix it for you in the back end, so it'll be fine. So it'll come through correctly to Roger.
Yeah. I mean, the reason for that is, as I say, that we're on a fairly tight program, and there's actually 6 of us that do the RDE checking, and so we divvy up all the NGOs between us, and it's just much quicker to be able to see the names than to see individual names. So thanks, Glenn, that's terrific. A couple of questions have come through. Jody, could you please talk about the reporting entity and GPF point you just spoke about? Yes, Jody, under under the Corporations Act requirements, but also under accounting standards in case you're not a company, and most NGOs, of course, are companies limited by guarantee, but they don't need to be. If you receive DFAT funding or any government funding, and there are other criteria, but that's, from your point of view, that's the most important one. You are obliged to report as a reporting entity with general purpose financial statements. And that obliges you to comply with all accounting standards. Does that answer your question? You can type a bit more in if I... You seem aware of the fact you've got... Oh, look, whether... Yes, there are some recipients that don't fully comply. I think, Peter, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
I have to ask my partners here because, as I say, we share the checking amongst us. So and the staff. So we might only be doing 10 each, and we wouldn't necessarily.
The most important thing is that you comply with the ACFID format in the Code of Conduct when you're preparing your financial statements. That's the most important requirement, because the RDE worksheet picks up items that are line items in the ACFID format financial statements. So we occasionally find NGOs, not many, but on the odd occasion, using line item descriptions that aren't in accordance with the ACFID format.
But if you read the definition of reporting entities in accounting standards and guidance notes, it does generally recognise that if you're receiving government funding, the government would want to see general purpose financial statements. But if DFAT is happy with the ACFID presentation, that can potentially give you cause to not fully comply with general purpose. There may be things in the general purpose requirements that have absolutely nothing to do with the aid program and therefore are not relevant to DFAT. I think it's worth mentioning that the ACFID Code of Conduct presentation is very directed at DFAT's requirements and indeed ACFID's requirements, but it does not in any way not comply with general purpose financial reporting or the requirements of the Corporations Act or accounting standards. It's more of an elaboration of those figures by specifying certain items of revenue and expenditure, none of which is inconsistent with any of the requirements of the Act or the standards. Okay, so moving on. Now, as I say, I'm not going to hang around too long on this section. It's there for reference, and frankly, these slides are probably 2 or 3 years old because nothing's changed in that time. And this is just running through the worksheet where total disbursements should be taken directly from the bottom line of your revenue account and the bottom line, above the profit of your total disbursements. And then you should take from your accounts the value of any gifts in kind or volunteer services to get actually your total disbursements net of those figures. And then, of course, in order to work back from your total expenditure to your total eligible expenditure, we next take out the DFAT expenditure, because, of course, this whole exercise is directed at your expenditure out of funds received from the Australian community, and amongst the exclusions from that, of course, are government funding. And so you have both DFAT and other Australian government funding to be taken from your expenses, together with overseas revenue, whether from organisations or individuals, simply because, again, it's not from the Australian community. And other exclusions, and this is all covered in full detail in your RDE explanatory notes. You've got welfare, evangelistic, and political activities. I think don't take evangelistic too literally. Whilst the true meaning of it is the conversion of somebody from one faith to another, I think the intent is that it should cover any sort of religious proselytization. Channeled funds which are moving through the NGO to go to another organisation, but not under your ongoing control, and funds from funds paid to international partners, alliances or affiliates, anything domestic because it's not relevant to the international program, fundraising costs in their entirety, and administration costs. The exception being that going back to the previous, if in your DFAT figure you have excluded your allowance of 10% administration costs, you don't need to take that 10% out of this figure here. Well, you do. You don't need to take it out of there. Again, going back to DFAT, and I'll come back to that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Moving on. Welfare. Perhaps I can give an example here. I don't think they're one of the participants today, but I came across a very good aid program in Africa where women and their children were being rescued from a situation where they were kept effectively imprisoned. It wasn't a prison, but they were effectively kept within compounds with no freedom whatsoever. And the NGO progressively paid for their release and then trained them into useful, domestic trades and so on, weaving, basket making, that sort of thing, to enable them to be self-supporting. And that was good aid, particularly good aid. But if in fact the NGO had simply supported them after releasing them, in all likelihood that would have come under the heading of welfare, to the extent that it was not creating a sustainable situation in the long term under the general objectives of the aid program. Moving on, channel funds, we've mentioned those. They're funds simply that pass through. Do you want to mention anything there, Peter?
Look, there's not that many NGOs have channel funds. We sometimes ask for further details if we have an instance where there have been channel funds in the current year's RDE worksheet. We've got the last couple of years worksheets, so as an exercise we always compare what's on the current RDE worksheet to previous periods, and quite often we'll query any changes. So we'll be looking to see whether there's consistent treatment of various items from year to year.
Yeah. Okay. So this is funding coming from global partners, which doesn't meet the criteria of coming from the Australian community, and domestic projects we've mentioned, in other words, Australian expenditure. But we will come to support costs which are available. Fundraising costs, this is not allowable, but you doubtless appreciate that community education, which is covered next, is. Now, your expenditure on fundraising is quite specifically excluded, but it is common practice, of course, for that fundraising expenditure to be linked very much into your community education, which is eligible to the extent that it includes the cost of producing and distributing materials to promote your program and inform the public of what you're doing, and any meetings which you might hold to elaborate on that, clearly within the hope that this will enhance your ability to receive donations. So there's very much a fundraising aspect to it, but the DFAT definition of the division between community education and fundraising is essentially along the lines that you have to calculate the proportion that your fundraising actually is as a part of your community education. And I think they quote an example of a 20-page brochure, and one page is the form that you fill in to make a donation. So 1/20th of the cost is deemed to be fundraising, and the 19/20th is community education. It might not be so easy if you're delivering lectures on the program, and quite naturally you would seek donations as an element of that lecture, which normally is a very brief bit at the end, and it's just a matter of doing the right thing in dividing any cost to leave the pure community education claim as the amount in your RDE. And then administration, and this does include administration of any offices which you might have overseas, which would particularly, of course, apply to the larger NGOs. And I don't know that we've given a definition here. It is in your mandatory notes. And Peter's handing it to me. Like audit, legal, accounting, investment losses or profits, losses, membership subscriptions, office costs, rent, maintenance, depreciation, utilities, bank charges which aren't related to donations, and general staff training. Those costs which are allowable under the ANC funding up to 10% of your DFAT expenditure include salaries of administrative, clerical and other support personnel not directly involved in the program but who support DFAT related activities. And this is quite an important point actually, because this admin includes those people in your office who receive reports from overseas, who prepare ad plans, and also those of you that actually do the RDE worksheets. Now these are obviously very much related to your aid program, but they are not a visible part of your allowable admin. They're regarded as overhead admin. And this, again, be careful that, and we know that this does confuse a lot of preparers of the worksheets. If you deduct the full amount of your DFAT funding expended, and I'll come back to that, that would therefore automatically include your 10% allowance within that DFAT expenditure, and therefore you do not deduct it again from your admin expense if you have left it, if you've deducted it from your DFAT funding. Now, with regard to DFAT, and this is a very common error which we'll come to again, but strictly speaking, the DFAT figure which is written back, which we covered earlier, should be the DFAT expenditure. The expenditure of the DFAT funds, not the actual receipt of it. It's fairly common practice for the smaller NGOs, possibly because they've spent it all, depending on what's in the ACFID compliance table in their notes, to put their actual receipt of DFAT funding in as an adjustment rather than the actual expenditure, which should be in that cash compliance note under the ACFID Code of Conduct presentation in your notes, where you've got opening and closing balances of the funding, further expenditure, further income during the year, expenditure and closing balance. Ideally, the figure adjusted for DFAT should be that figure. Okay, Pete? Any comments?
No, that's fine.
I get the chance to have a glass of water every now and again if Peter says something. And again, disallowed is any funds sent to international regional affiliates for their administration, fundraising or promotion of the organisation. And then we arrive at the cash RDE by this somewhat circuitous route before going further to add back the value of your eligible gifts in kind and volunteer services. Now, again, this is covered in quite easily readable detail in the explanatory notes. The gifts in kind must be sent overseas to be eligible, and they may include anything that's valuable to the aid program of a non-cash nature. With regard to the volunteer services, this is a little bit more complicated and should apply to services of volunteers directly related to the aid program and not to fundraising or anything like that. And the RDE notes do provide for definitions of any volunteers, whether it be a project assistant at the lower end of the scale, through middle professional, team leader, higher professional, and then periodically DFAT lay down annual rates of pay for these various levels. They define six levels from project assistant, higher professional, and that then enables you to relate the amount of time involved to the annual rate and proportion it to calculate the value of the volunteer services, which we will then subsequently check, of course. And finally, that will give the total recognised development expenditure. That's reiterating essentially what I've just said. And so the next fairly old slides, as you can see, but nothing's changed, show the appropriate disclosure. Now, most NGOs will show gifts in kind and volunteer services as both an income item and an expenditure item in their revenue account, so that it effectively cancels out. The alternative is to put it in a note to the accounts disclosing it, or you can do both. You can put it in both income and expenditure and then perhaps elaborate on it a bit in the notes. Because it might only be called something like non-cash income, non-cash expenditure in the actual income and expenditure account. If this value is not included in your financial statements, it is not eligible as part of your RDE. And therefore, it goes without saying that one would strongly recommend that if you do have volunteer services, you should if you want to maximise your funding, disclose it. And certainly in the church organisations, it's inclined to be higher. In our experience, certainly a number of some of the larger NGOs do place no value on it. Is that a fair comment, Peter, do you think? As I say, we don't all do everything.
Yeah, look, because quite a lot of NGOs have a lot of volunteers, but quite often the volunteers are a type that wouldn't be eligible for RDE in any case. A lot of NGOs have volunteers involved in fundraising activities or admin. They're not terribly much involved in program support. So in those cases, quite often the NGOs don't bother recording the amounts and claiming them.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Just a bit more elaboration there. And the valuation which I have already mentioned. And so those notes may be helpful as an aid memoir rather than all the detail. I do recommend you also refer to the explanatory notes if you're not completely clear. Common errors and issues which have come to our notice, which we do report to DFAT on an annual basis. We've already mentioned the NGOs that registered in their own name, which Glenn has now got in hand. The RDE figures occasionally can't be traced to the financial statements and require following up. And it's too common, unfortunately, and this is where I think we'll put in a plea, that worksheets are not loaded to enable RDE figures to be reconciled with the audited accounts in the in the instances where the financial statements do have a different figure, or as I said earlier, for reasons of costing methods and allocation of expenses to programs and so on. And therefore, look, I do appreciate that your explanatory notes do, through the actual worksheet itself, let me quote, does make it optional as to attachment of the worksheets. Where is it? NGOs may wish to, this is quoting it, NGOs may wish to upload working documents or calculation sheets to assist in reviewing your RDE calculation. This is not compulsory. NGOs may be asked to provide this material during the desk-based audit of RDE submissions. Well, I haven't made a note of how many we have to ask for details, but I can assure you that it's a very large proportion. I don't know why this was made optional. It seems completely illogical that one should have figures that don't agree with no explanation of why they don't agree. So I can only put a personal plea from Sterling's and the other financial assessor that please, if the figures don't readily agree, attach a schedule, and this will save us all time and email correspondence. And so that's quite a big issue. That does waste a lot of our time, and the receipt of accounts being unaudited doesn't constitute a major problem. It's usually a matter of us checking the worksheet, setting it aside, and asking the NGO to send the audited accounts. Directors and auditors have signed them. This does occasionally occur, and even with some quite large NGOs. and of course, if volunteer services or goods are claimed without them being in the AFS, we have to reject them under the rules. Now, if some non-compliance with the ACFID Code of Conduct, although I would personally say, subject to comments from Peter and Kit, wake up, Karen, from my partners, that generally speaking, NGOs do comply well with the ACFID presentation. Is that a fair comment?
Look, we probably get a couple of instances where there's a line item description that isn't in the ACFID format, and we have to ask for details of what it includes, to determine whether or not it's eligible. But it's not a major issue. It's very rare.
Well, the second item, really, ineligible disbursements, is just straight-out errors where the relatively involved explanatory notes can sometimes be misunderstood. And likewise with the inclusion of administration in eligible expenditure. This can be a facet of the NGO's counting system, in that they might wish to allocate overheads to their different programs, and so when it comes to doing the worksheet, they have to be taken out again. Or indeed ineligible projects, whether domestic, welfare, evangelistic, or the channel funds. And I suppose the most frustrating issue, rather than error, is, and this would also apply to our spot checks, is when the key person to help us simply isn't there. They're on leave or travelling somewhere else, but this can be very, very frustrating. I mean, it can virtually almost waste a trip on a spot check visit if the person who prepared the worksheet is no longer available. And so we plead to plan ahead. The worksheets are due in by the end of March this month, and we will be probably checking them, and I understand at least one has already been lodged, which is very impressive. We will start checking them around mid-late March, depending on the rate at which they flow in. There's a lot of work that needs to go into the IPF calculations and dealing generally with DFAT in the lead-up to the budget, and therefore it is important that we don't, strike a snag which causes an undue delay. Now, before we move on to spot checks, I think it sounds as though we're on the air. I can hear rustling noises from my phone. Would anyone like to ask any questions at this point, particularly on the worksheet and the preamble? All happy or asleep?
Any questions, guys? Feel free, if you've got microphone availability, to call them out, or feel free to type your questions in on anything that Roger's covered so far.
There was a question before. Oh, Catherine. Catherine wanted to answer a question from WWF. Oh, and Monica. Sorry.
No, sorry, Roger. I think that was just them noting that they were online.
Oh, sorry.
That have come through since Jody, so...
I beg your pardon. Right, okay. Right, we'll move on to spot checks. We've still got question time at the end if anything occurs, anyway. So, Look, DFAT might like to comment on this, but spot checks are generally about every 5 years. If there was any concern from our point of view in checking worksheets, I mean, not a minor concern, but perhaps a more major concern, a spot check might be brought forward. But generally it's a 5-year circle. And if there has been either a new accreditation or a re-accreditation in that period, it would be deferred probably to about 5 years after that, to the extent that an accreditation or a re-accreditation does involve a financial assessment, which does include RDE, and so everything possible is done to avoid any undue duplication. Fair comment, DFAT?
We actually have a risk-based process for selecting who will be experiencing the joy of an RDE spot check. So there's a number of factors that we take into account for that, and of course one of those is the time frame for the most, for accreditation or re-accreditation, and then another number of other risk factors that we take into account to select.
Absolutely, yeah. So you would generally be given about 10 days notice, and the timing of the spot check would inevitably follow the allocation of ANCP following the May budget, and so it's likely to be taking place in June, July, or possibly a bit later. Initially, we do a desk review in our office, and then 1 day on site. We're then obliged to report back in draft form to you, the NGOs, within 5 days, and we will then expect to receive your comments, following which we will send a final report, incorporating comments as necessary to DFAT within 15 days of our visit. The actual agenda for those spot checks is that on arrival, we give a pre-briefing outlining our requirements, who we'd like to speak to, usually a bit of a quick audit to see that they're actually there, and then we obtain the worksheet and all supporting financial statements and schedules. In addition to schedules, that would generally include ledger accounts which back up the worksheet so that we can examine the content of each component of the RDE to assess its appropriate eligibility. Valuation of volunteer services and gifts, which has been covered, is certainly an item which we would direct attention to if it has been included in the RDE. We would then recheck against the records, which would have been done anyway previously in our office, and finally, through the data that we obtain details of in the ledger accounts, make sure that everything complies with the principles for both the eligible and ineligible expenditure, ACFID compliance generally, and then at the end of that 1 day, we would conduct an exit interview, which would probably include a slightly larger group than the initial introduction, and we would expect to see the CEO and any board member that might like to turn up. Issues? Again, well, I mean, not dissimilar to the exercise which we do annually. Admin costs incorrectly included in expenditure that's otherwise eligible, and fundraising included in community education. Too easily done, because, as I say, most of these figures go through the accounts together, and therefore it does take some effort to segregate them to arrive at the appropriate RDE, and some lack of attention to the ACFID Code of Conduct implementation guidance, which includes the formatting of the accounts and templates and so on, and of course the RDE explanatory notes. But as I say, I think compliance with ACFID generally is good. And of course the unavailability of key personnel, which in the case of a spot check can be extremely frustrating. And questions or discussion? Any uncertainty in any areas? Anything you want to add, Glenn?
No, I'm fine for the comment.
Pete?
Look, I just say if anyone, any people that might be being involved in the RDE calculations for the first time, if you need assistance, don't hesitate to contact us. For all of the accredited NGOs, we've got the last 2 years calculations and supporting reconciliations. So if there's anyone that's new to the system and perhaps might not be able to find details of previous year's calculations, we might be able to help you.
Yeah, that's a good point if you're new, yes.
I think for any new NGOs, I mean, I guess in general too, sorry, Marty from DFAT here, if you do have questions and it's more appropriate for us to get you in touch with Sterling, then please feel free to contact us via the ANCP mailbox for those NGOs that are part of the ANCP program. For those of you that are not accredited and listening in today, you of course can come in via the accreditation mailbox and speak to the accreditation team that way. And where appropriate, we can put you in contact with Sterling if needs be.
Yeah, I mean, we can't do your job for you because that could constitute a conflict of interest, but we're certainly more than happy to clarify the treatment or even your presentation of your accounts, Jody, and whatever. But yeah, always here to help. And as I say, that's very much in our interest because we do want to get this March exercise completed as quickly as possible to give DFAT the maximum amount of time to prepare for the budget.
So any questions, it's your last well, it's not your last opportunity, of course. There's always an opportunity to contact the ANCP team with any other questions you might think of after today. There's a question or comment there from Jody for you, Roger, that I might let you speak to.
Oh, no, sorry, Jody, I wasn't even, not even faintly suggesting that. I think you're speaking, academically for others here. No, not at all. No, as I say, generally compliance is very good. And particularly with the larger NGOs, and know that looking at the names on the board here, there's some very, very high quality presentations from these people, which is good. It's
Well, Roger, it looks like we don't have many other burning questions, but as I said, of course, everyone's welcome to contact the ANCP team at any time if you have questions about RDE, questions about Smarty Grants and how to enter your data into the form. We reminded you all, for the ANCP NGOs, in the bulletin that was sent out 2 weeks ago that the RDE pages are now up on Smarty Grants. They're open. You can enter your information and submit that at any time between now and the 31st of March. So as Roger said, if you're ready to go, to hit submit now there's two NGOs that have already submitted theirs in there already. So please, if you're getting them done early, we will start working on them early. That's fantastic. We will send out a reminder to all of the ANCP NGOs in the next couple of weeks, just a reminder that 31st of March is the close-off date for the submission. So please, between now and then, do get in contact with us if you have any questions. Otherwise, it looks like all quiet on the questions front, and it might just be up to me to thank you all so much for your time, taking time this afternoon to participate in the webinar. Thank you very much, Roger and the team there at Sterling, for your presentation and information. And we look forward to speaking with you all either in person or at the next webinar, which I can't even remember off the top of my head the date for the next one, but we look forward to seeing you all then. So thanks very much, guys.